Good evening. So nice to see you all on a beautiful evening out in a beautiful location. Um, as Mia said, my name is Ben Metcalf, and I am on the faculty at UC Berkeley. I teach in the Department of City and Regional Planning, um, but I also run the Terner Center for Housing Innovation at UC Berkeley. I get to work with an amazing group of students and researchers trying to figure out ways to create more housing that's more affordable in ways that align with our climate goals and ways that foster economic mobility. Um, I also do a lot of work. We run a wonderful accelerator program where we actually get every year to see a lot of the most interesting startup companies in the nonprofit and for-profit space that are bringing forward new ways of working. And so between the students and these new companies bringing forward new ideas, it helps keep me a little optimistic in the face of what otherwise can feel really challenging in this moment, with housing prices and rents being where they are. Um, our conversation tonight is with Jerusalem Demsas. I think all of you know her. I know of her. We're super lucky to have her here and super grateful to Emerson Collective also for facilitating this conversation with her. She is best known as a staff writer for The Atlantic magazine, where she has the real luxury to be able to take on long form, like true investigative kind of reporting of a sort that I feel like is so rare out there today in the media sphere. And at The Atlantic, she has written a number of pieces that have sort of gone viral, at least among the communities that are interested in these topics, including writing a lot on issues of institutional failure, the ways in which the systems that we build don't deliver very well on the goals that we have. And housing in particular has been a key focus of her, non-exclusive focus. She seems to kind of range far and wide, but has been a recurrent thing that she comes back to again and again and again, and thinking about why we keep falling short, even in democratic states and places where we have great aspirations to do better on housing. She came to The Atlantic from Vox.com, where she also sort of built her brand as a great thinker on these topics. And she's also, I feel like I have this wonderful relationship with her just because I'm always listening to her fantastic podcasts, first with The Weeds and now um, with her podcast, um, Good on Paper. Thank you. Um, where she covers all kinds of topics on interesting on our best ideas that ought to work, but somehow don't. I think our most recent episode was one on poverty and why we endure people living in poverty at the kinds of levels that we do, even though we've seen incredible drops in poverty rates over the last couple of decades. In any case, my job here is actually to ask the questions and to stop talking. And I am going to turn now to get the conversation going to you, Jerusalem, and ask you just to start with a little bit of like, how did you get to where you are? How did you find your voice, and what sort of led you into this wonderful niche that you've discovered?
First, thank you everyone for coming out today, and Emerson and Ben for taking the time. I think everyone has had housing experiences that have in some way radicalized them. Whether it's trying to find an apartment in a supply constrained market, or it's thinking about whether you're ever going to be able to afford a home, or it's thinking about whether your kids will ever be able to afford to live near you, or if you can live near your job, or thinking about how you'd love to live near your friends or your family and get help raising your kids, and realizing that a lot of that has to do with the housing availability in your community. And it's funny, like, people often ask me this question, like, "How did you get into housing?" I feel like everybody's in housing, like, everybody thinks about this. It's one of those things when I talk to, people I meet all the time through life, not even when I'm reporting and I say I work on housing, they immediately have, like, very well-developed thoughts and beliefs about the issue, because it's something everyone has to think about all the time. It's the biggest expense everyone faces every month, whether it's your mortgage, whether it's your property taxes every year, or it's your rent. So personally for me, I mean, housing has been something that's really important in my life. When my family moved here, we were Eritrean asylum seekers, and we moved to the DC area. And the place that we ended up living, I found this out actually only like a year or so ago. It was in a very exclusionary suburb, predominantly white suburb in Maryland, right outside Washington, D.C. And it was a set of townhomes. At the time, I never really thought about it, but later I was like, why'd they allow townhomes in this extremely exclusionary single family housing area? And what I realized is that some progressive city planners had done an experimental program to do exclusionary zoning, which meant they were going to, as they were building the large single family homes, they were going to require building some middle income housing that was going to be affordable to people, because it was smaller, because it was actually at a price point that would be achievable. And we rented one of those houses, and that's what gave me and my family access to economic and educational opportunities that we otherwise may not have been able to access. And then later on in my life, when my parents got divorced, we were figuring out like how, divorce is one of the most expensive things families can go through. If you talk to folks who works in homelessness, or you talk to homeless folks themselves, you will repeatedly hear that whether it's a breakup or a divorce can often lead to that kind of instability because it's extremely costly for both members. Thankfully, my family was never near that kind of a situation, but what did happen is we had to figure out, okay, we're all, you have 3 kids in K-12 and you want to stay in this very expensive area and so they can continue going to their good schools. Like, how are you going to afford that as now 2 households? And thankfully, there was a great pro-housing YIMBY council member named Hans Reamer in Rockville, Maryland, who had ensured that Rockville Pike, which I'm giving you very local Maryland geography now, Rockville Pike had upzoned and made it possible to build apartment buildings downtown, walking distance from the best magnet program in the entire county, which I went to. And as a result, we were able to stay and go to that school because my dad had to work still, and so we had to be able to walk to school and live in an affordable place. And so we were able to rent an apartment building while still staying in the townhouse with my mom. And that, to me, like, those kinds of stories come up all the time for people. You can't plan for that. When you don't know what family's going to move to, some community in 20 years, and they're going to need housing because one day that family will get separated and will need to remain in that place. You can't plan for that. What you can plan for is creating a housing market that is liquid enough, that is easy enough, that has enough diversity of housing types and areas that it can absorb people when their lives change, that it can absorb different types of living, that if families want to have a grandparent living as well, that there's space for people to build ADUs in their backyard, that there's space for people to live the lives that they want. And so I think that for me, when I realize how much lives are constantly constrained and also enabled by the housing choices that we make, it made it really clear to me that this is one of the biggest, most important issues to work on. And then in college, I studied economics, and you start really formalizing a lot of these ideas into not just your own personal lived experiences, but really seeing how they affect things in a macroeconomic way.
Yeah, I love that because you are in a way where you are today because of these policy decisions that happened a generation ago.
Everyone, it's so crazy. Like, everyone is. It's like you don't even realize that the choices some zoning chair made, some developer made, some homeowner association made 20 years ago are defining how you get to live right now. Whether you are living near a transit, whether you're living near a highway breathing in smog, whether you don't have a house near your family, those aren't even decisions you get to make alone. It's happening because 30 years ago, someone said, no, we're not going to allow apartments near single family homes. And now we have this situation where, I mean, we see tons of course, gentrification in this area as a result of that.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of us think of this very binary housing world where it's like, okay, there's like public housing projects over there and then housing like for the rest of us over here. And I think your story is great at just like blowing that up. It's like, no, everybody, almost no matter where you live, is where they are. They're beneficiary of a mortgage interest deduction if they're a homeowner. They're where they are because of freeway siting decisions 30 years ago. And so on and so forth. So you wrote this this put together this fantastic book that's an anthology that captured a lot of your best writing over the years, and you provocatively, I suppose, titled it put the words housing crisis in there. So was that just obvious too that you would refer to this moment that we're in as a housing crisis? I'm just curious what that title means to you and why you think that is a useful way to think about the situation we find ourselves in today.
Yes, it's obvious. I think this is always I think the thing that can be interesting to disentangle is whether there is a housing crisis or if there are many different kinds of housing crises, and that can get I think people can find it difficult to engage with the word housing crisis because I am talking not about every single way that housing can be harmed. Like you can't fix a lot of my work is focused on the problem of supply. Why isn't there enough housing? Why is there enough housing where people need it? Why isn't it available to the kinds of people that don't have access to tons of resources? Where is that availability being blocked? And that's the housing crisis I'm referring to. And I think that housing crisis is upstream of a lot of the other ones. I think because we don't have enough housing, we end up pushing a bunch of people into homelessness. I think because we don't have enough housing, we end up allowing landlords to treat their tenants like garbage. I think because we don't have enough housing, landlords don't have to upkeep their homes in a way that's actually even in accordance with laws, which are honestly quite minimal in terms of quality and housing quality. But on top of that, too, I mean, just think, I mean, when I was a renter, I went to college in Southern Virginia, and you know, there's a rule in Southern Virginia. Many towns have this ordinance, but you're not allowed to have more than 3 unrelated persons living in the same house as a tenant. Which is, if you think about that, like the most insane thing that the government gets to tell you to do, you are not allowed to rent with more than 3 people that are unrelated to you. And the obvious decision to do this is in order to make it difficult for tenants to have roommates because that's how you'll be able to afford a single family home split 4 ways instead of like 3 ways. And so, of course, college students couldn't afford this. In order to get the very constrained housing that existed in Williamsburg, Virginia, you had to split it 4 or 5 or 6 ways. And so what that ended up happening is landlords knew that you were technically breaking the lease by allowing multiple people to live with you. And so they did not have to keep the housing up to code. And so what happened, I had a friend, I was visiting her house one time, and I was like, "Hey, did you know there's like a wire hanging down in your shower? Like an exposed wire?" She's like, "I don't know what I'm supposed to do about that. Like I can't do anything. I can't tell anyone. I can't complain to the landlord. I can't do anything about that. I can't afford to fix it on my own." Like she'd tape something on it, and I was like, "All right, I think maybe you shouldn't shower." Like, and they're like, I think let's just avoid that area. But stories like that, I mean, Williams, Virginia has fought repeatedly against allowing more housing to be developed, of allowing even schools. I mean, this is something you guys in California are very familiar with. Berkeley has had such a hard time building housing for its students, and there's a student homelessness crisis as a result. And this is directly because people in the community have opposed it on pretty specious grounds, pretending it's progressive. I mean, you hear the most insane rhetoric from people who are opposing these kinds of developments. And I think it's really important to realize that the direct harm that's happening, people often think they're fighting, oh, I'm sticking it to a developer. I'm sticking it to a rich person who's going to live in a luxury town. No, those people are going to be fine. That developer, he's going to sleep easy at night. Those rich people, they'll have their housing. They'll have their millions of dollars. But the people at the bottom end of the tenant market, those people are who are getting screwed every single time new homes aren't built. And I think that that's, to me, a big part of why I think it's a crisis is that's starting to spawn all of these other, related and equally devastating crises, particularly when we think about homelessness.
So how did we get here? I mean, what's interesting to me, first of all, is that what you're saying is an idea that has really only recently gotten traction, at least in the national discourse. This idea that we just need to build, and we need to build all kinds of housing in all kinds of places. And even if the immediate beneficiaries of those, luxury condos aren't going to be, the people that we want to benefit from, they'll still indirectly, that idea is one that certainly developers been maybe saying for a long time, but hasn't been getting broader traction. And I'm curious about kind of why you think this idea is now getting resonance, how it's getting resonance. And it does strike me that there is a little bit of a, uh, maybe we're going back in time a little bit because there was a moment, right? If you go back to the post World War II years, for example, when it really was easy to build, right? And so, are we seeing just this is the way it works? The pendulum switches, so it goes one way and then it goes back again. Like, what is going on with this moment that feels unique to you?
Yeah, I'm going to answer your question, but I first want to actually address one thing, which is this idea that luxury housing is going to people that maybe it's not the direct people we want to help. I hear this a lot because I think many people come to housing as they're concerned primarily about homeless folks and very low income renters who are being exploited. And they're like, we need to build housing for them. And that is absolutely true. There needs to be affordable housing, and particularly we need to max out rental vouchers and make those things actually cash vouchers rather than able to be discriminated against by landlords. And we need to do that to help folks at the bottom end. But people need to understand that luxury housing is like a developer marketing word. They put luxury housing on every single new development. When I first moved, I moved to Columbia, South Carolina for a job when I was like 23 years old, and I went to live in a luxury apartment building, and it was like the most disgusting place I've ever lived in my life. And it was a new it was like new. It was like 5 years old apartment building, but it was seen as like it had that same like look. Everyone knows what that look is. That like sort of like, gray and maybe like bright green, and there's like an orange stripe somewhere for some reason. I don't know why anyone did that. And that's a look that everyone's like, that's like that luxury building that's not for people like me. When you go into these buildings and see who lives in them, these are not like the wealthy elite people. Those people are not, you don't see them in near these areas. They live in brownstones in Brooklyn and in Palo Alto and other places like that. They do not live in these new developments. It is true that often the folks who live there are yuppies. They're wealthier on average, maybe, or they have higher incomes on average than maybe the median person who lives in a community. But are we saying that we don't think people earning $60,000 a year should get apartments? Are we saying people who earn $80,000 a year shouldn't have a place to live? And I think it's like, I'm not saying that you're saying that. But I'm just saying, like, I think it's something I hear a lot, and I think people's implicit understanding is that, oh, it's a net negative if the new building isn't for the very worst off. Everyone here is suffering, and we need to build so much housing for all people, and we should feel excited when anyone else gets to live where they need to live for their jobs, for their families, for their homes. Every additional unit is a family that gets to live where they have to be in order to access the life that they want. And if we conceive of it as that, then it becomes less, oh, we're burdened by this new housing. But no, we get to create a bigger community with more people who can become our friends, our neighbors, people we date. My editor, Yoni Applebaum, actually wrote a book called Stuck, and it's a great book. Everyone should read it. I should talk my book, but his book is very good. He has this story that he tells where he went to a zoning meeting in Washington D.C. and there was a woman there who got up, and they're talking about a development and whether people would be opposed or in favor of it. And she got up and she said, I used to come to these meetings and oppose housing development. And then 10 years ago, I made a friend, and I realized afterwards that she lived in a building that I had said I didn't want built. And I think it's really important to realize when you're saying you're opposing housing, you're saying you are opposing those people living in your community. It's not about the buildings, it's the people who live there. And so that's a very long answer to the not your question. But
I think it is. So it's an important point because those people also came from somewhere.
yeah.
And I think there's a myth out there that a lot of folks somehow just appear from nowhere. Or, I don't know, they come in from, who knows, Iowa State or something. But in fact, like the research is pretty clear that when you build even high-end units, whatever they are, the large majority of people are then basically freeing up other homes in the neighborhood, which then become available for people to rent or purchase at often lower price points because they're basically upgrading. And those people then are moving into those units, thereby freeing up other units.
I mean, raise your hand if you live in a house that someone else has lived in before. So everyone here is living in what was once luxury housing. And if that hadn't been built, where would you be living right now? And I think it's something you really need to think about because often I understand the reflex to be frustrated that the way that the private developers work is they're starting at the top end of the rental market. But it's important to realize that if they don't start there, then one day you will not have a house. Nobody ever starts out there, like no one has a starter home that's a $1 million mansion in Palo Alto. You start off somewhere smaller that's more affordable to you. That's how housing markets work in the entire world. 90% of this country lives in housing that someone else lived in before. And it's really important to realize that by acting like these new homes are going to stay stagnant there, it's a problem. But to answer, I actually forgot your other question. I'm sorry.
This seems like we're in a little bit of a moment where the discourse is like turning a little bit among elected officials, among influential thought leaders towards this idea that we do need to build more. And I'm wondering kind of if you think this is where you think we are in that trend, and then also if it's simply taking us back to where we were, or if it's something really unique.
Yes. So, in the post-World War II era, we have a huge housing shortage. We hadn't really built in this country since before the Great Depression at that point, and you had all this pent-up demand because the Great Depression obviously had really stagnated demand in this country. There hadn't been a lot of construction of housing, and then World War II happens, and you see tons and tons of military-age people leave the country. Also, of course, reducing demand for housing. They all come back. All these young men. Everyone's jubilant. We won the war. Everyone's getting married. Everyone's having babies. Now we have baby boomers. Welcome to those of you who are here. And as a result, everyone wants a house. You want a house to start your new family, to make sure that you have a place for your kids to grow up. And we see an explosion of growth that power the middle class. Every politician on both sides of the aisle constantly says this, right? They're like, wow, the post-Great World War II boom built the middle class. And that was about a 4 million home shortage that we eliminated in a few years. That's about half of the problem right now. Um,
And it's worth noting that many of those homes are things that aren't actually getting built much anymore.
yeah.
Like, we don't do a lot of the triple deckers and the 2-unit buildings and the starter homes. We have sort of lost that muscle, which is a really interesting thing
Yeah,
to him.
exactly. And I think then there were some very reasonable concerns to the amount of growth that were happening at the time. There were real critiques from environmentalists that were saying, hey, a lot of development is happening, but are we preserving land for conservation? Hey, a lot of development is happening, but are we ensuring that stormwater runoff is not destroying the health of our neighborhoods and our communities? Everyone in California knows a story about Los Angeles and smog. I mean, these are real concerns about development, not just housing development, but there's a lot of energy development happening at the time, a lot of just manufacturing, a lot of industrial development, and all of this kind of gets pulled together into one. All of this development is seen as like, this is the problem. We're moving too fast. We just have to stop. And so what happens around the late 60s, early 70s is an anti-growth movement develops in this country locally across the United States. Some parts of this anti-growth coalition are good, well-meaning people who are just concerned about the health of their local communities. They're concerned about the environment, and they want to make sure there are laws in place to prevent harm. And we get really great laws out of this. The Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act. These are fantastic developments that I'm very glad are here, and I hope remain through this administration. And at the same time, though, that is not the only sentiment that's building. A lot of what's building is also anti-growth because people are not just, something I always like to say is the last house anyone wants to see built is their own. And then you're like, stop, this is the frontier. I just want it to be green space now. I want parks. I want no more housing. And so that is that coalition that develops between the people who are environmentalists, who are concerned about development for very tangible reasons I think we all share today, and then people who are just opposed to growth, whether because they don't want certain kinds of people moving near them, or they just like the green space near them, or they're just upset about congestion and parking issues. Also, reasonable concerns to have given how badly the transportation development happened at the time. All of those things meld together and create a very difficult problem because these all happen at it's not like one law passed that we can now be like, okay, now we need to repeal this law or reform this law. Every single locality in the country start passing extremely complex and specific and idiosyncratic laws and regulations and rules about how you're allowed to develop. The preference turns towards things like large single-family home tracts, banning apartments, segregation by class and by race happens very directly, and you hear it in the very language people are using at the time. We don't want those kind of people moving there. I mean, even as recently in the 2010s, you will hear very blatantly in even very liberal jurisdictions, people saying, well, those kinds of people shouldn't get to live here, being very clear about who they're talking about. But even implicitly, every single time you say that someone who should not, you shouldn't be able to build something smaller than a single family home or even a nice townhouse, you are essentially putting a class barrier in your community. That is literally what's happening, whether or not people want to believe that. And so I think what happens then is in this moment is that the pressure is just built so much. For a long time, we could absorb the housing pressure, right? Like in San Francisco, San Francisco was growing. The Silicon Valley happened. A lot of people began moving here. It's not like, development and growth completely stopped, but the rate of development relative to the population growth was so small that all of the benefits of that growth began getting capitalized into the prices of housing instead of being distributed into everyone being able to get access to those good jobs. So now we have the situation for, the first time in American history, the mobility of Americans in the last 50 years has declined such that so few people are moving, it would feel unrecognizable to people who were living in the United States in the 1900s. And this shift, I think, is really what has made it important right now for people to, why it's become such a moment, is that the pressure has just been building now. In San Francisco, maybe you'll move 30 minutes away from your job. Maybe you'll move 40 minutes away from your job. Some people are willing to move up to like 2 hours from their job, but most people will not do more than a 30 or 45-minute commute on average. They refuse to do it. And as a result, they start crowding in. And so now, here in San Francisco, you're very used to seeing 5 or 6 people living in a home that was originally maybe meant for like 2 or 3. And that kind of crowding increases the pressure, increases the pressure. And then it gets to the point where it's not just a homelessness problem. It's not just low-income renters who are struggling, who are living 2 hours away and taking 5 buses to get to work. It's now those high-income yuppies, the children of the boomers who got to have their shot at the middle class. Those kids now, their parents are looking around and they're like, why can't you buy a house? I used to be able to buy a house. I was 25 years old and I bought it for $5 in an Apple. And it's like, oh, like you can't do that anymore? And you really can't. And honestly, I actually feel like, I don't want to make it, there's no resentment towards people. Everyone should be able to have that opportunity to have access to that kind of housing. But it's a real shock because if you bought a house 40 years ago, it's really shocking to see what the housing market looks like now. And you're only really seeing it through the eyes of your kids or your grandkids. And I think that pressure, that it's gotten to the point where they're really upset about housing too. It's gotten to the point where you now have all of these young people who are actually making good incomes, like not able to afford housing. That I think shocked a lot of people.
Well, right, and though that's also where the political power tends to lie. I mean, you've moved to a different section of the population that is more likely to show up and vote, that is more likely to donate to politicians, is more likely to work on campaigns. It's that I think is channeling it to sort of a felt, gosh, if I'm elected into office, I'm coming in thinking that housing or homelessness has got to be, if not a top one, at least top three issue.
Yeah.
So there are, I guess people will say though, wait a second, sure, what you're saying makes some sense, but careful because what if we go too far, right? And I think we're seeing this a little bit now with the federal government, right? I've seen a lot of folks who are saying, well, wait a second, the federal government is gonna Trump is saying he wants to give up make federal land available for housing, but that'll just be like suburbs gone crazy. Like, how do we think about that? I think there's also folks who say, well, geez, we don't want to go back to, living in tenement slums, which weren't safe and where, I don't know, diseases were, so like, is there any validity to that? Do you think at all like, hey, maybe we might be too successful, or is that just
I am not worried about that. So I would love to have that concern. So, you know, like quality standards are important. And I don't think there's a single person who thinks we should allow there to be changes to the building code such that there will be health and safety problems. That is, no one is talking about that. We are talking about in places where residential development is already legal. It's already legal to build a large single family home. Should you be allowed to build a small single family home? Should you be able to allow to build a home that is a small setback from the property line rather than one that's 10 feet, 15 feet long? Are there the health and safety concerns with townhomes being developed in these places, with apartments being developed in these places? There's no real health and safety concern here. And I think people often will bring this up. Some people I think are actually in good faith concerned about the problem of overdevelopment happening. But I think a lot of people are using this as a way to make it seem like the only options are the current existing development landscape or the most dense, dark thing you could imagine where nothing is the same. You can't see any parks. People we've been to other, I mean, many people here, I'm sure, have been to other countries, right? When you go to Paris, are you like, whoa, like they've destroyed the beautiful buildings? And no, there's like 7-story buildings everywhere in Paris. When you go to Milan, when you go to Tokyo, when you go to Seoul, I've not been to many of these places, but I've seen photos of them, and they're much denser than this. And I think it's important to realize there's nowhere in this country, other than some parts of Manhattan, that is as dense as normal cities in other countries. There is not a single place in San Francisco, not a single block in San Francisco that is comparable to what we're talking about here, that is normal, nice, beautiful place that people enjoy visiting when they go on vacation. But I think that this broader concern of just, what if we develop badly? I think is what I hear. Like, okay, I would like more housing to exist, but I want it to be, very beautiful. I don't want it to look like that annoying orange stripe building, etc. Right? I understand these concerns. I think these aesthetic concerns are not actually crazy. I think I get why people are frustrated that every single new development kind of looks like that, kind of looks the same for some reason. First thing I'll say is the reason all developments look like that is because it is the cheapest way to build according to the building code. To build it differently would mean that the price would go up. So I think we all need to reckon with that. So there are ways to make it then less expensive, right? Like if we make it easier, if we reduce the regulatory burden on developers to be able to build more housing, that will actually free up creativity. I have architects talking about all this time. They get into architecture to do very, very cool, beautiful buildings, and they're not able to do anything. They're not able to do anything. And I'm sure there are architects here who are very frustrated, yep, right there, who have this problem. And you can't, because in order to conform to building codes and deal with the fact that you're trying to serve a market that can actually afford your home, you have to follow these kinds of facade regulations. But I think that in terms of concerns about whether this housing is going to be if with Trump opening up federal land or having places we don't like in California, this is a democratically controlled state. There are Democrats in the city council. There are Democrats in the state legislature. There are Democrats at the top of the ticket everywhere you look. So my question is, if you guys want to develop differently, you really can't blame Republicans in D.C. for that. And I think it's a crutch that people have used for a really long time now to say that, oh, well, we can't do it because Republicans are like, that's not relevant to this conversation. Development is happening locally, and if California decides it wants to build in a more effective way, in a way that's trans-oriented development, if you want to build in a way that's going to be sustainable with the environment, then you can do that because the demand exists here and will be absorbed. And the important thing is this: every single person who's forced to leave California for Arizona or for Texas, do you think they're going to go move to a walkable community and not drive? No. Every single one of those people is moving and increasing their CO2 emissions as they do so.
But you're touching on a core kind of political power kind of question, which is every Democratic elected official in California is getting elected saying they're going to do something about housing and homelessness at this point. And also true, they are running their campaign with the direct support of environmental advocacy organizations who like the status quo, with community groups that like the status quo, sometimes very parochial labor groups that also like housing, but only if it's getting built by their members. And so you have, I guess, the real political question is like, is the Democratic Party in California sort of captured by a set of institutional interests such that these kinds of incremental changes will only ever be incremental and sort of like a new movement is needed, or there's some way to blow that up?
Yeah, so and I'm talking generalities here. There are a lot of people who work in environmental groups, a lot of people who work in tenant rights groups or other kind of groups or labor groups that are not the problem. But in general, what we are seeing in not just California, but in blue states across this country is that the general public is being, I think, lied to by many of these groups about how actually you can benefit how you can actually solve the housing crisis. Many of these groups are opposing common sense reforms on housing. Right now, I think that there's a bill in the California legislature to exempt housing from California Environmental Quality Act, which is basically the California Environmental Quality Act just says you have to go through some reviews to make sure your home is not going to violate standards. Okay, we're going to find thing. This is on infill housing. So places where housing is already allowed, should you have to go through another level of review and potentially be sued over the fact that you're building housing that is an apartment building or a townhome or whatever it is. And environmental groups are not coming out in favor of this. This is a straightforwardly, obviously pro-housing, pro-environment thing. And if you don't live in infill, you will sprawl out into the suburbs. Like, getting more people to live in infill housing is the most environmental.
Send them to Texas. Right?
Or send them to Texas or to Arizona. getting people to live in infill housing. I think this was a Berkeley study actually that showed that it is the most environmentally conscious thing a local government can do to impact its own emissions footprint. And so to me, it's not that I think that the folks who work in these institutions are bad or evil or they don't actually care about the environment. I think what's happened is everyone in this space has got seized with an anti-development fever that they have now put on every type of development. Yes, there are bad developments. Everyone knows this. There are bad iPhones. There are bad, like, different types of, like, manufacturing outcomes. But, like, would we say on food, because there are some bad farmers, that every single food item should go through a regulatory review process that triples, quadruples, quintuples the price of food? No. We would think that was ridiculous. But that is literally what we are doing with housing. And so I think that we should take the same approach we do with food, with other kinds of quality goods that we think are positive and net positive for, or positive sum for our community, and say we should have quality checks, we should have regulations and regulators to make sure things are going appropriately, but we should treat it like something we want to exist. We should treat housing like something we think is good and positive for people, because I think right now the political issue is that many of these groups who have captured the Democratic Party have not been forced to reckon with the fact that the downstream impacts of their behavior has been the immiseration of millions and millions of people.
So I'm actually interested in this question because I think we are seeing, California was at the front, partly because California's housing situation was as bad as it was. California was at the front end of trying to do a lot of the reforms that you're talking about. But we now see a lot of very red states. Montana is the Montana miracle comes to mind. Utah is another one where you have a governor there, a legislature that are really taking up the mantle and actually running forward a lot of the reforms that California has tried and failed or tried and stumbled on. And I do wonder, it's interesting the way that this crosses over political parties and doesn't fall neatly into the red and blue box. And I wonder, it's really one of the few, there aren't a lot of other issues, I think, that do span the part in a very hyper-partisan world that we live in that sort of are able to capture both Republicans and Democrats, at least of a certain mindset.
Yeah, I think this is actually something that, I'm not a partisan person, but I am a liberal person ideologically. And I think it should be a huge embarrassment for liberals that working class people flee states that we run and go to states that conservatives run. I think that, like, there is now a desire to make it seem like, there's some good work being done here in California and Oregon and Washington, but the vast majority of good housing bills have come out of Republican states. They've come out of Republican states. When you look at California, the top reason why people leave this state to go to Texas or to Arizona is because of housing costs. These people are not leaving because of the tax burden. They're leaving because of housing costs, and they're going to these other states to find a place to live. They go to Florida from New York, same thing. And I think it's really important to realize that the working class dream cannot be found in a place where the rent is $3,000. So I'm just saying, if this is a place that if people want to claim the mantle of liberalism or progressivism, it is kind of confusing to do that when you're pricing out every working class person. I do not care what your DI statement says. I do not care about your land acknowledgments if the rent is that high.
And it's worth noting too, there is a like when you think about like redistricting and congressional seat apportionment, California is a little bit locked in amber right now, stuck at 40 million people, won't budge. We won't build more houses. People are leaving. Other states, like the ones you mentioned, are growing rapidly. They're going to get a greater representation in Congress and be more likely to determine the future of the country's politics.
Yeah, California is going to lose congressional representation and Texas is going to gain it. Yeah. That's what's happening. So the increasing representation of rural Republican states is happening as a result of California and other blue states' housing policy.
We're going to start opening it up to some questions from the audience. But before I do that, Jerusalem, thank you again for being with us and sharing your thoughts on this. I'm just super curious. Do you have any housing projects that are in the works or things coming up down the road that you can share that you're working on?
I can't share anything I'm working on right now. Ben is trying to get me to make news, I guess. But I am working on a new project that I'm excited to share with everyone when it comes out.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Nice try. I'm a journalist.
Well, all right. You dived the question. That my next question for you is: what is the favorite housing-related story that you've reported on? What have you enjoyed working on the most of all the pieces in the anthology or elsewhere?
Oh wow.
So I'm shocked you haven't done this one before.
No, I actually haven't. Okay, my favorite piece I've ever worked on, it's like related to housing, but it's more about like local government and how it works. I reported it in DC where I live and where I'm from, and it was about this. I was watching a DC City Council meeting, and it was in the height of like the pandemic was happening. We're having a homelessness crisis. I mean, it was a lot of stuff was going on, and it was a total like an hour and a half meeting. And for 30 minutes of the meeting, the city council members started talking about like whether or not they should remove 3 trees from a single lot in Southeast DC. And I was just like, what is happening? Like truly, like what is happening in this conversation? Like I couldn't even understand. I was like watching it, I thought I was having a stroke. I was like, am I like understanding? I was like looking at the captions, like, are they saying trees? Are they saying something else? And I was like, because there's a big initiative also to plant more trees in DC. So I couldn't figure out what was going on. And so I was like, I'm just gonna go and look into this. And my editor was like, why are you spending time on this? This is like I'm like, it's fine. I'll do it on the weekend and don't worry about me. And so I went to this area. I went to the place where the trees were legit, and it's like a really nice like lot. I was like, I didn't even I'm not I wish I could show you a photo. The photo is in the book. And you can see it's like a beautiful lot. There's like these large trees and I started asking people like, hey, is there like a problem with these trees? Like, they have no idea what I'm talking about. They think I'm a batshit crazy woman, just like wandering around asking them about trees and like if there's a problem with their trees. And then I find out that there is one man who is a landlord of a nearby building. And his name is Daryl Ross. And Daryl, I feel bad, is a very nice man, but he is the villain of our story. And Daryl is a well-connected but not really political person in Southeast DC, which is a predominantly Black area. He also is Black, and he worked in some way for the local councilman. And he had gotten upset because the DC Department of Transportation had put these trees on public land near his building that he does not live in without asking him. And so he'd gotten so mad about this that he'd started like calling them up, like over like a year and a half, had been calling them up. This one man had been saying the whole community is really mad about these trees. Like, how dare you put these in here? And I was like, I met Daryl and I was like, hey Daryl, like, what's up? Like, are you okay? And he's just like, yeah, like I'm really upset because DDOT just does this stuff. They like drop bike lanes and bike racks and trees, and we have to stop it. They have to listen to us. They have to listen to our voices. And I was like, but people voted for a mayor who started a tree initiative to plant tons more trees in Southeast DC because of the lack of tree canopy in disproportionately Black areas. Are you against that program? And he's like, no, I just think that the community should be asked. And I realized what had happened is that Daryl, because he was friends with a council member, had managed to work the process for a completely unreasonable request. No one could justify this request, to the point where 4 different city council members visited that lot. DDOT had to assign an individual person on this case for a year and a half to manage his requests. They eventually put growth inhibitors on these trees so they wouldn't get too big because they might hide criminals. And eventually, this man had a veto power over he had a veto power of how those trees development happened on that lot. And I realized this moment, and no one thinks this is rational. No one, some of DDOT had actually quit their job over this. Like, they were like, this is so insane. I'm like so frustrated. I feel like I'm being treated terribly about this by this man. And he had lodged a complaint with like the city attorney, like all of this stuff. And it was such a microcosm of the problem of local government, where this one person, there's going to be crazy people no matter what we do. There's no policy in the world that's going to stop like crazy people from existing. Again, sorry, Daryl. Very nice man. But our institutions should not be so weak that when one person is being unreasonable, they are incapable of saying, no, that's not okay. Like, we planted trees for the good of the community, and if you would like to say that there was some harm done and make a lawsuit, that's available to you. You can claim that there was some harm done, but you don't get to take up tens of thousands of hours of city time and take away the right of regular people to get the benefits of what their elected officials have actually done here. And when I do housing work, I often run into people, you know, they're pejoratively referred to as NIMBYs, people not in my backyard, people who are opposed to housing in their areas. And the thing that I think most people view it as that these are the villains of the story, but I think the villain of the story is the way that government has been incapable of balancing their interests with the rest of ours. By making us responsible for having to show up to zoning board meetings and scream about more housing in order to get a place to live, we elected you.
you're supposed to figure out how to do that without being captured by random people, random groups. So to me, the villain of our story is not really Daryl. It's the DC City Council that couldn't figure out how to do its job, that couldn't figure out how to actually say no and to empower public servants and say, we trust that you put trees there for a good reason. And so that is, I think, my favorite story I've ever reported.
Awesome. Thank you. Process fetishization, I think is the. Do we have questions? Are there any audience members who would like to? Leah, are you
Yeah, we'll pass the microphone around. Oh, there's one.
and introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Mark Dyden. I'm an East Palo Alto resident. I'm also on City Council.
You're the problem.
I mean, I've read your book. I'm a huge fan of Jerusalem. If you guys have the book, read it. It's just a great, summary, and it's a amazing writer getting to the essence of it. And it's very easy. It takes a difficult subject and makes it very digestible. But my question is, here in East Palo Alto, we haven't actually built any market rate apartment buildings in the entire history of the city. One of the arguments against building market rate housing is that it will lead to gentrification and displacement. So if you two could answer that question, does building new housing lead to displacement, or is it in fact what stops displacement? Or is it more complicated?
Yeah, I mean, I think that gentrification is such a big word. I think people often mean many things when they say that word. There is the thing that I think is the most concerning is, are people actually being displaced physically from their community? Are people not able to live in place where they want to be because they've been priced out of it by some entity or some phenomenon? That to me is the most important concern. But there are other parts of gentrification too, right? When your community makeup changes, a lot of other things can change. You can change your sense of your community can change. You don't feel like you're living in a place where you grew up. You feel like you used to be able to speak the language you were speaking with a bunch of your community members. You feel like the norms in your area have changed. Different cultural touchstones no longer are possible. The businesses may change as a result of the new population. So now that it's servicing a higher income population, you may feel like that used to be like a local store that I could afford to buy, my fruit or my groceries in, and now it's like a high end, I don't know, Blue Bottle. What's the new thing now? I don't know. I'm not from the Bay Area. And that I think can be psychologically hard, and there are also some real policy downstream concerns. We see it in gentrifying communities. For instance, we see the rate of police calls for noise disturbances goes up. So you see real impacts of gentrification happening. But displacement specifically, I think it's important to isolate.
Well, they're not synonyms. They're different words.
Yes, exactly. So displacement specifically, the idea, are people being forced out of their community by housing? Is that happening because of new homes? And the answer is no. And the thing that happens, the reason why people believe this is happening is because new housing comes as the new residents are coming. So people just put two and two together. They're like, my community has changed. These new developments are here. They caused the problem. If these developments weren't here, then the new people wouldn't have come and my community would not have changed. And the causality is actually reversed. People move to areas because of new jobs, because, they're moving out of their parents' house, because they have to move because they were priced out of their old place. Demand pressure is coming in for a variety of reasons that have nothing to do with the housing stock availability. And when they come here, particularly wealthier people, they come here, and if there's not housing available to them, what they do is they bid up the price of existing housing. So if the new development does not come, it cannot absorb newcomers. And I think this is really well told when you look at what happens in, my sister moved to New York after she graduated high school, and she was making a good salary. She and her husband were living in part of Brooklyn on Red Hook, and it was nice. They were renting an apartment, and they both made a good income. They're near the top of the rental market. Well, not for New York, but they're doing fine. And I went to visit them because I was like, oh my gosh, my sister lives in New York. She's so glamorous. She's so cool. I hope Abigail's watching this. And I was like, hey, like, your fire alarm is like broken, and also the stairs are like completely wonky. Like, I almost fell down them, and like, you told me that there's a repeated carbon monoxide alert. I'm like, why are you living here? And she's like, this is the rental market in New York City. And this is what happens, right? When you don't build enough for people who can afford nice housing, they take up housing that was been more affordable to people making less money. And you can see this very clearly in housing markets all over. In DC, where I live, there were a lot of these family units. There were row houses that were developed that were meant to be for families. DC is a very black city that has gentrified as well. And I ended up moving, and one of the things that became much more affordable housing is that they ended up renovating a lot of these homes into 3-level housing apartments. So then it became affordable to people like me, like, okay, now there's an apartment here, there's 3 people there. But that home used to be affordable housing, and because they did not build enough apartments, then it was re-renovated to become housing for yuppies. And so I think this is a thing that we need to think about a lot with gentrification, is that the goal is not to stop change. You can't stop change. You're either going to change in a way that you can develop inclusively, or the change will happen because people are forced out. If there's only 100 houses, then the only 100 people can live there. And it's going to be the 100 richest people, the 100 most powerful people. That's what's going to happen. But if you build enough for the newcomers, then it's possible for everyone to be able to live there. So I think gentrification, I think it's a complicated conversation. It's beyond just displacement. But on displacement, it's really important to realize it is harmed by not building enough housing.
Another question. Microphone coming. Yep.
Hi, thank you for coming to East Palo Alto. My name is Isabel Lopez Ismail. I'm an East Palo Alto resident. So, in California, over the last 5 years or so, there have been a lot of laws passed that are meant to incentivize or to get rid of obstacles for developers to develop. But I mean, it's not worked, is the issue. So, you're talking about leadership, political leadership. The governor wants us to build, the legislature wants us to build, but it's not happening in cities. So to me, it seems like a lot of the issues are with local governments, with municipalities. And people on council, they're voted by people. So they feel like they are doing what citizens want and residents in their cities. So I think the issue with NIMBYism is there's no incentives for people, like economic incentives for people to want to see additional houses built in their neighborhood. They just think, oh, they don't want my property values to go down, or they don't want to see the neighborhood makeup change. But are there policies that you've seen throughout the country that are actually finding ways to incentivize people in cities to want to build? Because we can pass as many laws in state legislatures as we want, and it could do absolutely nothing. So, are there any success stories out there?
So, I'm going to challenge a bit of the premise of your answer, because you're right. A lot of bills have passed in California. And to be honest,
We had 130 that
Yeah.
asked the state legislature. They did 1,000 last week. Just last week.
yeah, I want to be clear. This is not a complicated problem, right? Like, I could go into a zoning document right now and do Control F, parking minimum, delete. This is not confusing.
Amen.
Like, really, like, there's a lot of legislation that is confusing. Tax policy, it's very complicated. Healthcare policy, very complicated. This is not, even housing finance, very complicated. Zoning regulations, minimum law, these are not confusing. Anyone in the stock, we could go right now, show you on a computer, you could delete half these things immediately from the code. So this is not like, oh, we need 130 bills because we're doing really complicated legislating. They do not actually want to solve the problem. I want to be really clear. They do not actually want to solve the problem. Because we know this because we used to already do this. Building homes is not some new technology they're figuring out. California built a lot of housing. And right now, Texas is building housing. Arizona is building housing. Montana is building housing. Idaho is building housing. Florida is building, I can name every single Republican state. They're all building housing. And the important thing to realize here is that I think, you are correct that, like, localities are the problem, that they are the big roadblock to this. But I think that if a strategy that goes locality by locality is doomed to failure, because by the time you solve that problem, how many people have been made homeless by that? Like, it just takes too long. I think that's why the pro-housing movement has moved to focus on state level action. And I think a lot of these bills have not been super effectual because they've been so small. I mean, like, we're talking about minor changes to zoning codes in a lot of places. The one real success story of California housing policy recently is about ADUs, where right now, because after 30 years of laws, after 30 years of trying to legalize ADUs in this state, finally, this state is building ADUs, and 1 in 5 new homes in 2022 in California was an ADU. They told you. So 1 in 5, that's 20% of the new housing that is being built is only legalized by was only legalized in the last few years by these laws. So I think it is clear that these laws can have massive impact. The question is, will legislators be willing to take up the courage to do so? And I think the other part of your question, which I want to address, is this question about is it the case that everyone's just voting for this? Is everyone just actually just voting to have no development, no housing? They just not really want it. I think when you look at local government, what you see is a story of non-participation. You see vast majority of people do not vote. People who do vote, even if you vote, you don't really have a choice usually. There's not really contested races in many, many different elections. If it is contested, do you have that much information to even distinguish between the different candidates? If you can distinguish between the candidates, do you even really know what those jobs do? Is it really legible to you what every single person does? The historic preservation person or the council member or the county council person, do you know what all these different groups do? I can't figure it out. And I do this for my entire job. And so all of these things make it impossible for democracy to actually be functioning properly at the local level. And as a result, most people don't engage, let alone don't vote, let alone don't come to the council meetings. So when city council members tell me oh, my constituents just want this, what they're saying is the 5 people who bother me every week don't want this. And I think actually a lot of these folks should look internally and say, did I get into this? I think most people who work in local government are very, very well-meaning people who want to help their communities. Did I get into this to be the mouthpiece of a few people who don't actually represent my community? Is that what I'm here to do? Or did I get into this to try to make my community a better place? And to me, my concern is that, there is a belief that all of these people are opposing housing, and we just have to accept that, not status quo. If you ask any person in this state their top issue, the most likely answer you're going to get is housing costs. So while it is the case that comes into contest sometimes with, are they upset about development near them? Are they upset about parking near them, etc.? The goal of representative government is to mediate those concerns. It's not to just say, well, someone told me they didn't want to do it, so, well, why are we paying you? Are you joking?
And I think, isn't there a part of it too that part of what government needs to do is also communicate that housing has these benefits, and that by not building housing, actually you lose something, right? So you lose the ability for your son or your or your parents or your school teachers to be able to find housing there. The community negatively changes without that intervention. Not to mention the property tax base stays static, right? So I think that's a failure too of governance not to be able to communicate that effectively.
Yeah, I definitely think people should make the positive case for housing. I think people should feel favorable about new development in their communities, new people moving in. And I will say, they are in Republican states, they are not launching campaigns explaining that housing is good. They're not trying to do innovative messaging about how working class people should live in that's not what's happening. They just have a regulatory system that allows for new housing to develop. And I think that there is a desire repeatedly to make this more complicated than it is, because the answer is most people don't want to deal with the fact that sometimes there are some market solutions that are a part of the way that we need to go forward. And every single person who is living in a house that was built by the private market should look internally and ask themselves, would I have preferred this house to never have been built? I get that there are some serious concerns. I have very serious concerns with how market rate development can happen. But the alternative is not some utopia where a beautiful house is going to plop down and no one's going to have made any money off of it, and it was just going to be built and it's going to be $0 a year. The alternative is homelessness. So I think that more people in blue states need to stop waiting for a perfect solution to come up and ask themselves, if the choice is between homelessness and some housing I don't like the look of, which am I going to pick?
Hello. It seems like in the Bay Area, it really comes down to land, and they're just
Can you stand up for a second? I don't think we can actually see you.
Yeah,
Sure.
sure.
There.
It seems like it comes down to land, and there's actually I think one piece of land in Palo Alto left, and it's on Ramona, and I walk by it often. But there's just nowhere land left. And so in Texas, there's a lot of land. You have all these massive acreage right outside of Austin, but here there's just
What
no.
about right here?
Pardon?
What's right here?
This is a unique property with a unique situation. However, most of the Bay Area is already claimed, within 30 minutes of a major city. And so in that situation, it's like a mathematical physics problem, and the only option is to go up. Vertical is the only option. And now we have a bunch of people here, East Palo Alto. Would you guys like to see 30-story buildings? Everyone raise your hand.
But that's a straw man. What about six-story buildings? Why not townhomes? Let's
I mean, but in Palo Alto, it's predominantly 1 story, right? 1, 2 story. And so if you ask Lorene if you could build a 30-story next to her house, she's going to say no. And so the people that own those houses, they really don't want tall buildings there. And so I'm not sure. And then it seems to be a transportation issue. If people can move faster, I personally love this idea of a hyperloop system that can move people at like 3 to 5 times faster than cars. Because then people can live 3 to 5 times faster or 3 to 5 times farther from major cities comfortably. And that honestly seems like one of the most realistic solutions to this problem. Because people can live in Walnut Creek, all the land is that far away. But unless you guys are going to bulldoze these houses and build 100-story apartment complexes.
So I think I want to take seriously what you're saying here, because I think you're right that obviously there are a lot of people who don't want to see a big amount of density happening near them. I think that's clear. When you live in a lot of people who live in low density areas don't want to see even a 6-story building go up near them. I think that they also don't want to see homelessness in their community. And I think we need to make it clear there are trade-offs here. But also, I would say this isn't about bulldozing people's property and putting without their consent, like homes that don't exist there. It is saying, hey, if you're a homeowner and you would like to subdivide your property into 2 townhomes or into a duplex, it is legal for you to do so. If you want to build an ADU that has an apartment, you want to have an apartment in your backyard for your mother-in-law, it is legal for you to do so, and it's easy for you to do so. It's not costly for you to do so. So I think that we don't have to make it this dichotomy between building Manhattan and East Palo Alto, or we remain as we are. It has to be that there is a way to actually improve the amount of density we allow. And I think it's not true that people don't want to see more of that kind of housing exist, because when you ask them, like, hey, where do you want your kids to live? Like, where do you want, I mean, this happened actually in Vail, Colorado, a very, very wealthy place as well, where they were having trouble actually having a housing for their staff. And so you weren't able to even staff the lovely luxury ski resorts. And so you have a situation where if you can't have workforce housing, you can't have all the amenities that people are looking for here. I think that there has to be more building at some level in the exurbs as well. It's not going to just happen in infill. There's just so much demand at this point that it can't absorb it. But the idea that the solution is only to have people live far out removes the fact that a lot of benefits of density include the walkability, that the fact that you want kind of diverse communities that people benefit from because of food, culture, music. There are a lot of benefits to cities that people like living with, and you don't get that if you don't have that kind of density. So to me, you're right. There are some people who are not going to enjoy having a new townhome development near them. The question is that more important than every other consideration that we're talking about? Is it more important than housing costs? Is it more important than gentrification? Is it more important than the environmental concerns we have around sprawl? If a community decides it is, like, that's currently what California is deciding, and I don't think the population's happy about that trade-off.
Let's, if we can maybe go in the back to the.
Thank you. Wait, she had a question.
Oh, yeah, please.
Just really quickly, hi, my name is Kyra. I'm a teacher in the community. My family has been in this community since before the city was incorporated. I want to say 2 things. So one, as a former planning commissioner, market rate housing has been built in EPA. Usually, 10 to 15% of the units are below market rate per the agreements that the city council makes with a developer. So I just wanted to clarify that. And my question for you is, have you had any interaction or consideration in your work of tiny homes in the housing conversation, and what did that look like, and do you think that that's feasible? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for your question. I think tiny homes in particular could be a really great solution, particularly for homelessness. We're seeing that in some places. I think it runs into the exact same problems that so much other housing runs into, which is that people are skeptical of new housing types in their communities, and like that is a hurdle that exists. I think the other thing is a lot of other countries that are able to do tiny homes, manufactured housing, the building code makes it easy for them to be able to manufacture that at scale. So like most of the housing that the boomers were able to benefit from in the post-war period was manufactured. It was literally like just being plopped right off the assembly line, dropped and assembled right in a suburban community. And that's kind of the housing that we want to be able to build again, like these smaller people don't realize this, but like the average starter home back then, it's like kind of like 1,000 square feet max, probably 800 square foot homes. Most people view that as too small for them right now. People's tastes have changed, they've gotten bigger, and that's fine. But the country's also a lot richer than it was then. But also, like, I think that there's been a problem where we don't even try to build small houses like that, where a lot of people would be fine with it. Not everyone. I think that's the problem too. I think a lot of people hear what I talk about, they're like, well, I don't want to live in a tiny house. I don't want to live in a townhouse. I want to live in a large home. And I think that what we need to realize is it makes it easier for people who have strong preferences for single family housing to live in them if the people who don't have strong preferences for single family housing have other options. I like living in a townhouse. I live in a row house right now. I've always lived in either an apartment or a row house or a townhouse. I enjoy it. I like the density. And if there's not another option, of course, I'm going to try to live in a single family house, right? But shouldn't that house be occupied by someone who really wants to live in it? So by increasing the typologies, by increasing these opportunities, it's really important. But on tiny homes in question, I think the real question is going to be around building codes, trying to reform those to make it easier, trying to incentivize manufactured housing. I think we can do a lot in housing finance at the federal level to try to make it easier for places to do it. But also labor becomes a problem here as well. So labor unions, there's a manufactured housing development in San Francisco, and it was union labor that built it in the factory, but it's a lot fewer union jobs that it requires than the union jobs of building homes in the traditional way. And so there's a lot of unions who don't like the idea of manufactured housing because they're afraid that it would reduce the number of jobs available. I think this is like, it is true on a project level, but on a macro level, if you make it much easier to build housing, there's just tons more construction jobs you're creating. So I think you can make that trade with unions very clear, as long as you're like, hey, there's going to be a lot of work for you in either case, and it's still unionized labor building the housing. So that's a place where I think that the political dynamics you were talking about are really present.
I mean, I think you said earlier, like the ADU thing is really interesting. And California's one unambiguous success story is you can now add a unit to any single family home anywhere in the country with relatively little process. And if you combine that sort of zoning relief with these sort of different new typologies that can be built in the factory, you can imagine really accelerating that even more with more of these tiny houses being built in factories, whole casita, backyard cottage kinds of things that work with a lot of California single family lots. Really interesting question. Next.
Wait, here.
Do we have
Thank you. Hey, Jerusalem, big fan. You mentioned that you're from Rockville, Maryland, which is in Montgomery County, Maryland, which famously has this social housing program. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the role social housing plays in solving our housing crisis, and in particular, if you could speak a little bit about the Montgomery County model itself. Thank you.
Yes, the Montgomery County model is very, very cool. So essentially what they've done is created it's a complicated housing financing. They've created something called a revolving loan fund that makes it possible for the county to finance affordable housing. It's still built by a private developer. It's bid upon by a private developer, but the housing is owned by the county and it's mixed income. So you see a great variety of incomes living in it. The secret biggest problem they faced was the regulatory environment. Social housing, affordable housing, market rate housing all gets harmed by the same system. It's actually worse for affordable housing because affordable housing developers have much harder times sitting on land for long periods of time. They need a lot more capital. It's very expensive to do that. And so if interest rates rise, as we just seen them I was just seeing them do over the last year. While you're holding on to a lot of land, it could make sure that the project no longer pencils by the time you actually got all your approvals through. So these long approvals processes make it impossible for an affordable housing developer that got the land, did everything right, is building something for the community, income restricted. They can't do it. On the social housing part of this, like, I think that social housing is a really, really great tool, particularly for addressing income segregation. So right now, if you were just like upzone the entire country's existing residential stock to make it possible for anyone to build anything up to a 7-story apartment, right? A lot of the new development would be very income segregated, right? But the new apartments would go to people who are higher income, and then eventually over time you might see, like, in 20 or 30 or 40 years, more of that evening out. But that's like not great. Like, I think it's really, really bad to have really income segregated communities for various reasons. I think many people here would agree. But when you do mixed income, you can actually create that benefit in these very exclusionary communities. So in Montgomery County, they're doing this, and again, a very, very, great quality schools, good area. And I think the role for those programs is really to target areas where you want to see mixed income happen. So particularly putting them in areas like Palo Alto, in Montgomery County, Maryland, Northern Virginia, Westchester, all these different places. I think it's really great to focus on there. I think it can do a lot. One of the great organizations worked on this, the Center for Public Enterprise. I think any public official who wants to think about this more should talk to them. They're doing this not just in Montgomery County, but they're doing this in upstate New York. They're doing this in Atlanta, Georgia. But again, the biggest hurdle they faced was that a lot of local elected officials, a lot of local groups and community members tried to block the project, despite the fact that it was social housing, that it was mixed income, that there was preserving green space, that it was not adding a lot of cars because it was near transit, fulfilling every single checkbox that usually people bring up to oppose it. So it was near transit, all that kind of stuff. And still, the hurdles they had to face internally, the increased costs they had to face internally, made it such that the lowest band that they were expecting to actually serve could not be served because the cost rose too much. And so to me, social housing is an important part of the conversation. We're figuring out really cool new financing tools to be able to make it possible. And it is hampered by the exact same problems market rate housing is hampered by.
Okay. I'm not sure where to start, so I'll start here. I grew up in East Palo Alto. My family moved here in 65 when I was 5. Hold on. I have Alzheimer's and dementia too. 55 when I was 5. My godmother was the first mayor of the city. I've been all over the world. My biggest concern here, and I remember when they built the houses in the gardens, what they called the gardens, they were building them when my family moved here. My concern today is density. There are 5 ADUs in back of 3 houses, and it took me 15 minutes to drive 3 blocks to get out. I worked with Mental Fire and still doing work. When I was in the military, I had the blessing to travel all over the world, and I used to hang out at 14th and U. You know where that is. Okay. So I was stationed in Philadelphia, Jacksonville, Florida, Charleston, South Carolina, Norfolk, Virginia, and I've been studying gentrification in other parts where even in Jacksonville, where they had a black side of town in Edwarders College, that the last time I went there, all the homes were boarded up and they're moving out. And for people that were in projects, they said, well, we're going to move you out to these nice projects. You couldn't get back. But my biggest thing for this property, which is the best land on the peninsula, the first port city for the county. And why is East Palo Alto here? And Bay Road was because they would take the stagecoach when the creeks would flood down to the end of Bay Road, Cooley Landing, and float them to Alviso. We're in the middle of everything on the best land, farmland. My mom wanted me to buy a 2-acre lot for under $20,000 at one time. Still, density, how safe is it? Do you have a repack? If you haven't gotten with Robert Jones and the community emergency response, we need to find more of you there. How do you get away from your house? Do you have 3 escape routes? Are you safe? And I want density. East Palo Alto is here because Atherton, Palo Alto needed a workforce close at hand. So I'll shut up with all of that. And
Thank you. No, thank you for sharing that. I obviously think that's something that overshadows a bunch of the conversation in California is, of course, the fires, which are terrifying, and I cannot imagine what it's like to live in fear of that happening. And I think I'll say a few things. One is that in order to prevent development pressure in the what is it, WLUI? Is that wildlife refuge? The Wallui, to prevent development pressure into the exurban areas where fires are much more likely and common, you need to develop density in areas where they're fire safe. I think that is a conversation that has to happen. I mean, there was a great bill that was proposed by Senator Scott Wiener in this state that would try to look at the fire maps and actually be very clear about what places were fire safe and what weren't, and be just very direct about that. If it's fire safe, you can build densely. If it's not fire safe, you can't build densely there. And I think that that's obviously has to be a part of the conversation. We cannot be building in places that people aren't safe in. I think the other thing here is about transportation is really important. Ideally, we would have land use conversations integrated with transportation authorities and housing and land use folks who are working on housing development. And that's just not how we do it. And in California, I mean, and all over the country, these things are separated in a way that makes it really, really hard. So you don't have the types of transit-oriented development that you would want to see, such that a lot of the density is happening, near train stations and areas where people can easily walk to where they need to go, where you're not clogging up the roads with cars because people don't have to access it. You want those things to happen simultaneously. The thing I will just say is this: there's obviously a way on paper that you could create a perfect community. You could put all the houses on you could do a Lego community and make sure all the houses go here and they're safe and there's no congestion, there's no park, etc. But that's not the world that we live in, and we have to think about this stuff in terms of trade-offs. The question is, right now, given that California is facing millions of home shortage, where should those homes go? It's not a question of if they should be built, it's where should they go? Because they're either going to go in places that are more likely to be beneficial for the community, or they're going to go in places there people are going to be at risk of fires. It's going to go places that's going to cause environmental degradation. It's going to go to other places in the country where people are going to be forced to leave their communities, leave their families because they can't afford to stay here. And so to me, I agree you've raised some incredibly important concerns, and that's why I think it's really important to reduce the regulatory burden on things that are not safety issues. So aesthetics should not be the place where we're raising costs. We should raise costs on fire safety. We should make sure that things are extremely safe there. But why does it matter if something is not exactly 1 story, 2 stories? If it's 3 or 4 stories, is that more important? So to me, communities have to have these conversations openly, and everyone needs to be really, really clear what the trade-offs are. There is not a perfect solution here where nothing has to change and everything can be fine. Change is coming. It's going to come in the form of either fires, it's going to come in the form of homelessness, it's going to come in the form of community change, or it'll come in the form of deciding to build more housing and be an inclusive place for everyone.
This is just a really quick question, and it's about the practicality of ADUs. And where I live at, about 2 miles from here, I've seen 2 ADUs go in the last 2.5 years, and actually nobody lives in them. So the people next door to me built an ADU. It's their way of expanding their square footage. And I'm just wondering, how practical, and are there statistics on how many of these ADUs are actually being occupied and actually solving the problem they're intended to solve?
We did actually, the research center that I work with did a survey, a statewide survey in California a couple years back, where we asked ADU builders who's living in your homes. And interestingly, the answer, it turns out, is not that they're putting them for lease on the private market as new units. However, the answer is that they are generally being occupied. The significant majority of them are being occupied full time, but it's usually by a related party. So it's somebody they know, it's a connection they've been placed with. So I think the takeaway from, and yes, a lot of there's still probably a third that are being used for offices or extra space. And you could argue, well, why are we allowing that with the same preference that we do for folks who are actually prioritizing this for new housing. And I think the answer is probably twofold. One is like administrative simplicity. It's hard to actually bind people to use a structure in the way that they think they will when they first build it. And the second, maybe more optimistic answer, I think, is a sort of a policy theory that if you can make people sort of happier with the home that they have, they're going to be less likely to try and move to a different location and put pressure somewhere else in the housing market.
But the thing I'll say is this too, like again, that person's not going to live there forever. These homes that are being built, other people, particularly homes that are new now, they could live for 100 years, more than that. These are much better homes in terms of their ability to withstand time than the homes that were being built like 50 or 60 years ago. And as a result of that, the question is like, somewhat one of my best friends actually, right now she lives in she lives in her cousin's ADU. She's paying rent there, but she lives in her cousin's ADU in Tacoma Park, Maryland. And for a long time, it was these ADUs they were for like just backyard shed work or something. People just leave their stuff in there and live in there, but they were developed as actual full unit homes. And when she lost her job, she was like, I really don't want to move back home. I would like to stay in my community, I like to my area. And her cousin was like, listen, I don't want to charge you a lot. I want to charge you a very modest sum just to keep the upkeep and deal with like the cost of having a tenant. But you want to live back there? And if she hadn't had that space available to her, she would have had to go back to her house, and wouldn't have been the end of the world, but it wasn't the life that she wanted. And I think it's important to realize that again, like the flexibility of the environment, the flexibility of the housing environment enables people to be free to make many different choices. The government can't plan all the eventualities of your life. It can't plan for the preference structure that you might have in the future about who you want to live with, how many people, in what way. Do you want to share bedrooms? Do you want to have like different bedrooms? Do you want to have like a window in your place? Do you actually hate sunlight because you're a weirdo and so you want nothing in there? I feel like there's like so many different kinds of people and different ways of living that can happen when you allow the housing market and when you allow developers, private market developers, public developers, anyone to create different kinds of typologies, and you incentivize those typologies to be diverse, you enable so many different lives. So to me, it's like I agree. It's not ideal that in the middle of the housing shortage, the new units are not all going to housing new people, but our response to that should be like, well, we need to build a lot more housing then.
So I definitely get the sense that our wonderful guest could keep going until the stars come up. Her energy is amazing. I know we still have two last people with microphones. Is that right? Or just one? Okay. So why don't we have you close us out? That'd be wonderful. Thank you.
Me?
Yeah.
Okay. My name's Gail Wilkerson Dixon. I ran for city council. Margaret, my 5 people are going to tell you what to do here. Is it on? Oh, okay. You touched on I'm a real estate broker. I knew this area upside down the sideway, and I was surprised to hear about that young lady said that's what's going to be built out there. But when you were talking, you didn't mention anything about the corporations out of Canada coming into the United States and buying up developments, and that's a part of the problem. There's so many things you said. I've thumbed through your book, 137 pages, and you touched on a lot of stuff. Now, on the present city council, and you did mention that the councils were the problem. Not one of them have an ounce, now 1 hour of real estate knowledge. And you said the density, we're 2.5 square miles. And I'm trying to get them to go up so we can have 5 miles or 10 miles. So, that's another thing. How do we get out? 101, they've been talking about the loop off of Dumbarton Bridge. Should have went down Oregon Expressway over 25 years ago. But I guess my question is to you, have you come across the corporations buying up the land, jacking up the prices, creating a false, well, to me, present that we have a shortage, a home shortage. And like you said, people recycle the houses, and the average length of time that people own a house is like 8 years. That's the average of that. But that's my question.
I want to make sure I'm understanding you right. You're talking about large corporations buying housing
Developments, entire developments, and jacking up the prices, and also
Existing homes. Buying
yes.
existing.
No,
Buying
do
land.
developments, do developments and buying it. And they're also what we're finding in East Palo Alto. There's certain investment groups coming in and buying up the houses and flipping them. And
So I can speak to the part of this that is around institutional investors, whether it's private equity firms or other large investors who are buying up single-family housing stock. So the first thing I'll say is institutional investors have always owned multifamily real estate because individuals, of course, cannot afford to own an entire apartment building. So I think that I always find it very interesting how no one really cared about that, but now all of a sudden we care about this with single-family housing. But I think that the concern with institutional investors is usually about them raising the rents, like you were saying, jacking up prices by coming in and buying up these housing stock. And I think that when you look at the earnings statements, when you go listen to the earnings calls of these private equity firms, so Invitation Homes used to be the biggest institutional investor in the country. You know what they say? They say the reason that we're getting into buying single family housing is because the supply is constrained and so yields are high. Because they see, they're hungry for yield. These firms are just looking for high yield. They want to see high amounts of return on their investment. And when they see communities excluding more housing stock, they're like, we got to buy here. And you see this. There's a joke someone made that one day you're going to see at one of these council meetings some guy in a BlackRock vest going, okay, yeah, no more housing. Don't build any more housing. Because for them, that's how they make their money. Just look around. If you own a house in California over the last 40 years, you've seen your property value go up. Investment firms saw that and they said, okay, well, if they're not going to build, we're going to get in on that. The single best way to stop institutional investors from buying up housing is to no longer make it such an attractive investment. Because let me tell you, otherwise, it's very, very, very difficult to do this. And I think that importantly, even if you were to ban very large investors, medium-sized investors will do it. Small investors will do it. There's so many ways to do this that it's going to be very, very easy. When the yield is there, someone's going to go after it. So to me, again, it comes back to your original question that you asked me at the top. All of these mini crises that people point out about institutional investment, about the parking issue, about fires, about all these things, they stem from this one core problem of insufficient supply of housing. If you don't resolve that, you can't resolve anything else. That doesn't mean fixing housing supply fixes all housing problems, but it's a necessary condition to solving anything else. So before you can stop rapacious investors from coming into your community, make it possible for people to access homeownership, stop a homelessness crisis, make it possible for tenants to actually get their rights respected, you have to make sure there's enough housing to go around.
Okay.
Thank
Thank you.
Just wanted to say thank you. Thank you so much, Jerusalem and Ben. And thank you to Vice Mayor Dinan for sharing this idea to bring Jerusalem to East Palo Alto. And thank you to everybody for coming.
I do straight. I expect us. It's one in a little bit when the kid.
Okay, here? Or are you going to go?
Right.
Oh, okay.
It's kind of sorry. How about you here? What are you going to find still?
Right, I'm all set. It's just all the nails.